The civil rights movement has been going on since our country was founded. Our country was built on the belief that all men were created equal, except certain groups of people were more equal than others. In America, the South depended on slavery. This meant that slaves were forced to work doing hard labor for no pay. In many cases, they were beaten, malnourished, and killed while they were slaves. People in the North did not agree with slavery, and the northern states became a refuge for slaves that escaped their masters. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves to be free. Once free, slaves were still discriminated against. Most slaves could not read or write, making it difficult to find a job, so they returned to the fields that they were freed from. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, which outlawed slavery and made it a punishable crime. This gave African Americans hope that they would finally be treated as equals. Unfortunately, the Southern whites did not accept African Americans as citizens and continued to mistreat them. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed. It stated that all people born in the United States were citizens, and it included recently freed slaves. Shortly after, in 1969, the 15th Amendment was passed, giving African American men the right to vote. To try and counteract the progression of the African Americans, whites in the South created Jim Crow laws. These laws discriminated based on race. They made it difficult for African Americans to vote by requiring them to pass a literacy test before they could vote. Since most former slaves could not read or write, they were forced to leave the polls without voting. In 1896, the court case Plessy v. Ferguson allowed states to have separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks. This decision halted the progress that African Americans had been making. This allowed for Jim Crow laws to restrict African Americans without violating the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that separate but equal was not equal. During the court case of Brown v. Board of Education, this started what is now known as the Civil Rights Movement. After years of discrimination and oppression, African Americans had had enough and had begun to push for their rights. In 1955, an African American woman named Rosa Parks was riding a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She refused to give up her seat for a white man, which at the time was the law. Thus she was arrested. African Americans were outraged, so they started a boycott against the public transit system in Montgomery, Alabama, which lasted for 381 days. One of the predominant people in the boycott was Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister who ended up becoming the leader of the civil rights movement. The boycott resulted in Browder v. Gale, which declared segregation on buses unconstitutional according to the 14th Amendment. This was a win for the movement and propelled it forward. In 1958, at Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School, angry mobs attacked 9 African American students who were going to enroll in classes. This was unconstitutional according to the 14th Amendment, but the governor of the state, Orville Faubus, prevented the students from entering by having the Arkansas National Guard block the entrance. President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent the 101th Born Airborne Division to uphold the Constitution. The students were then escorted into school. African Americans in the South were testing to see if the segregation laws were being upheld. A group of nonviolent protesters called the Freedom Riders began challenging the desegregation of Southern buses and stations. The group was made up of 6 whites and 7 blacks who would ride buses from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. During the ride, the group faced vicious attacks, and one of the buses they rode on was firebombed. The group did obtain their main goal, which was to get the federal government to enforce the laws it put in place. This fueled the movement's participants to keep doing what they were doing, which was making a change. In 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, a church on 16th Street was bombed. The bomb killed 4 African American girls who were in the basement. Riots broke out in the streets. The National Guard was sent in to try and break things up. Dr. Martin Luther King later spoke at the girls' funerals. In 1963, the biggest protest in the nation at the time occurred. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. conducted the March on Washington. The march consisted of 500,000 people and went from Pennsylvania Avenue to the Lincoln Monument. People of all different ages, races, and religions gathered to protest the injustice happening in the country. The sheer mass of the march showed the power behind the civil rights movement. During the march, Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. The speech set the tone of the movement and inspired people to keep fighting for their rights. The speech was heard all around the country and showed people that change needed to happen. Malcolm X was another leader in the civil rights movement. He inspired a violent group of protesters known as the Black Panthers. Their goal was to protect African Americans from police brutality. On April 4, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. People were outraged. Riots broke out across the country, resulting in millions of dollars of damage. In some places, the damage left a scar that can still be seen today. People all over the world mourned King's death. They held marches and some schools closed in his honor. This only showed how the country was still separated. After King's death, people continued to fight for their rights and push for equality. To this day, people are still fighting for equal rights and honoring King's life by standing up for themselves. The civil rights movement is an ongoing fight for people and their rights that is currently happening around the country.